G-Man Boxing. Do you know what I mean? Every single live he donates. I see him on other lives donating. He's got the bag on it.
On the 19th of November, Demetrius Andrade is set to defend his WBO World Middleweight title yet again against another challenger who I don't feel should be in there, personally. And he's not pushing on. And I've been saying, it's been something that's been said for years. Demetrius Andrade is a fighter who, I think the first time I ever seen him was the Vanes Martirosyan fight. That was a split decision. And then I seen him against Brian Rose, and he looked very good in that fight. And he showed me a lot of boxing ability. He showed a bit of awkwardness. He showed some good speed, decent punching power, good shot selection. He showed himself to be a very good fighter. That Brian Rose fight was in 2014. It is now 2021 going into 2022. And he's not pushed on, had any real major standout fights. Best name on his resume probably is Vanes Martirosyan. Probably. And I gotta ask the question, what's the deal with this guy? Why do we have a fighter who on the surface looks to have ability, looks to have good skill, looks to be a very talented fighter? He's not getting the big fights. And he's doing himself no favours by just fighting easy touch after easy touch. We're going to have a look at Demetrius Andrade's career. And we're going to ask, what's the deal with this guy? You know, the pick through Demetrius Andrade's resume, amateur and pro, was quite interesting. He had an awful lot of amateur fights. BoxRec have over 60 listed. Now, BoxRec's amateur listings is very inaccurate. I mean, I think they have Alexander Usyk down as having 100 and something amateur fights, but we all know he had more. Likewise, Lomachenko. So it's very inaccurate. So he's probably had more than what BoxRec are listing. But some of the names I'm seeing here: Sean Porter, Austin Trout, Danny Jacobs. You know, and actually he's beaten all these guys. So it's not just that he's fighting them. He beat Danny Jacobs, beat Sean Porter, beat Austin Trout. Who else did he fight? Charles Hartley, I know him. He fought Charlo a couple of years ago. Jamel Charlo. We got knocked out by Jamel Charlo. Beat him, fought him. Who else? Mark DeLuca, we know him. He got stopped by Kell Brook. Then he lost to Sean Porter in a rematch. Some good names. Beat Keith Thurman in the amateurs. Lost to Erislandy Lara. That was a fight that should have been made when they were about 154 pounds. That would have been an interesting fight. But lost to Erislandy Lara, no shame in that. Lara, Cuban amateur, I mean, they take some beating. Beat John Jackson, the son of Julian Jackson. He's going to be off the rails. Diego Chavez, beat him. Beat Keith Thurman 3 times so far in the amateurs. He's got some good names there. I mean, when I look at Demetrius Andrade's amateur career, now you have to say, and of course, it's only over the course of 3 rounds. It'd be very different, you know, probably in a pro fight. But nevertheless, I mean, still some decent names on his amateur record. He was in there with big guys like Danny Jacobs, fought guys like Sean Porter, Austin Trout, awkward guys. Was getting the wins. So Demetrius Andrade showed promise in the amateurs. Now, he turned pro in 2008. And realistically, when I look at his early resume, he was matched soft enough. They didn't have appalling records. I mean, made his pro debut against a guy called Patrick Cape. Okay, now Patrick Cape was 4-2, and this was on a promoter called Art Pulio. It also had Orlando Salido on. It actually had Maxim Vlasov. It's crazy when you look back at some of these old cards, you know, from back in, say, 2008, 2009, 2010. It's crazy to see the names that are on it that would go on to do things. You know, Orlando Salido beat Lomachenko. Maxim Vlasov arguably should be light heavyweight world champion right now. Then after that, it was a month later, Eric Moratti, 0-1. Thomas Laws, 4-1. Javier Roman, 4-2. So he's fighting guys clearly not great, but their records aren't shocking. You know, you see guys that Anthony Yard was fighting early on in his career, and their records were abysmal. I mean, he's winning these fights, he's winning them in good style, he's getting knockouts, he's going rounds in some of these fights we're kind of going into 2011 now. Like at this stage, Demetrius Andrade, he's not really fighting anyone of note necessarily, but he's doing what he needs to do. He's beating the guys who are in front of him. He's fighting on cards that, Henry Lundy, we're on, Evgeny Ramon, Montel Griffin. This is on a card in 2011 where he was fighting a guy called Omar Bell. This is kind of the stage now where he kind of started coming up through the ranks. It would have been kind of around about that time, kind of 2011, 2012 kind of time, would have been where he started making the transition to world level. And that was when he ended up signing with Top Rank. And this is the interesting part, the Top Rank part. He fought Vanes Martirosyan in November of 2013. Now, he was down in the first round in that fight, but he did take over. He did get his boxing back together, and he was able to win a 12-round split decision. It was a very competitive fight, make no mistake about it. It was a very tough fight. Vanes Martirosyan, you would say at that stage, Martirosyan would have been in his peak. So, for him to get the win, vacant WBO title, getting up off the floor, coming through adversity, very good from Demetrius Andrade. He was out not long after that against Brian Rose. Now, that was the fight where I knew Brian Rose. I knew Brian Rose wasn't anything to write home about. His record at the time was 25-1-1. But Brian Rose was really a domestic level fighter. It had to be said. But saying that, he went in there and Demetrius Andrade absolutely lit him up like a Christmas tree. That was on HBO. Again, that was on a Top Rank card. It was a very, very good display for Demetrius Andrade. He literally broke Brian Rose down, smashed him to pieces. The referee stopped it in 7. Realistically, they could have stopped it an awful lot earlier than that, because it was just apparent who the better boxer was. And that, to me, was a showcase of Demetrius Andrade. He showed his speed. He showed his punching power, his punch selection, his volume, his awkwardness, his ring IQ. He showed a lot in that fight. Albeit against a fairly, overmatched opponent, he still showed, hang on a sec, this guy is good. It was at that time some people were saying, if he'd fought a Mayweather, how would he do? And you got to bear in mind, right? Some people could look back and say, look, Demetrius Andrade fighting Floyd Mayweather. Haha, you're joking. Even now it'd be like, Floyd Mayweather is an excellent fighter. Excellent fighter. But there's a saying, I'm going to come out with it. Styles make fights. Demetrius Andrade is over 6'1" with a much longer reach and much longer arms. Floyd Mayweather's never fought that. He's never fought someone like that. How would Floyd Mayweather deal with someone who can take his advantages away? Now, Floyd Mayweather, you would assume, because he's an amazing fighter, he was anyway, could have adjusted. I'm sure he could have. But how would he have adjusted? Because when we saw him late on in his career, when he was struggling to kind of pin McGregor down, and that was a much older Floyd, had to be said, he didn't look amazing on the front foot when he was coming forward. Much older Floyd, had to be said, but didn't look amazing. Would have been very interesting to see Floyd Mayweather against Demetrius Andrade, or Erislandy Lara. Erislandy Lara against Mayweather, that would have been a stinker, just going off topic. That would have been an absolute stinker, but it would have been extremely interesting because Lara had the longer reach than Mayweather, and he was slightly taller. That would have been very interesting. The problem for Demetrius Andrade after the Brian Rose fight was that I think there was some promotional issues there with Top Rank. He ended up, missing some time in the ring. He was out of action for well over a year. When he did come back, it was on a little card in Connecticut that didn't really have anybody really on it other than Henry Lundy. But it wasn't with Top Rank, it was with a little independent promoter. And then it seemed as though he was going down the road of fighting on PBC, believe it or not, because that same promoter put him on a card in June 2011. This was on the undercard of Ruslan Provodnikov versus John Molina Jr., which was a very good fight. It also had Zatichian, who famously was knocked out by Mikey Garcia. It had also had Willie Monroe Jr., who was just coming off the back of his loss to Golovkin at the time. So I had a few names on it, but it had Demetrius Andrade versus a guy called Willie Nelson. Now, the name Willie Nelson is a well-known name, but this Willie Nelson was a 6'3", 154 pounder. That's very rare. You see people who are 6'3", 154 pounds, and it was strange because this fight was built as a 6'1" versus 6'3" at 154 pounds, which you don't very seldom tend to see. You see that at light heavyweight, cruiserweight. You don't see it at 154 pounds. Now, I watched this fight. I remember it very, very well because I'd kind of forgotten. I hadn't forgot about Demetrius Andrade, But I'd known he'd been out of the ring for a while. This was 2 years removed, pretty much almost to the date after he fought Brian Rose. And I wondered, having not been at any real level, and Willie Nelson's nothing to write home about, but having not really been at any major level, how would he look? He looked, for my money, fantastic against Willie Nelson. He really, truly did. He looked fantastic. He had Willie Nelson down in the first round. He had him down again in the 11th round, and he stopped him in the 12th round. If I had one complaint about Demetrius Andrade in that fight, it was that he could have got Willie Nelson out of there a lot later than he did. It went 12 rounds. He was able to get the stoppage late on in the 12th round. He really could have got Willie Nelson out of there a lot sooner. But for me, Demetrius Andrade didn't show any signs of, slippage. He didn't show any signs of regression. He showed that he still was a very, very good, at least with the eye test, a very good fighter. And I still believed that this guy can get big fights and that he can cause trouble at world level. Who was he going to fight next? He was going to fight Jack Culcay. Now, the fight actually took place in Germany in March of 2017. Now, I believe this fight was meant to take place in November of 2016 originally. I believe there was issues with Demetrius Andrade not wanting to travel to Germany. He didn't kind of go into it, but I remember this fight being penciled in for, I think it was October, November time. And of course, I was looking forward to it. When that got binned, at the time, I thought, well, that fight's not going to happen. And I worried Demetrius Andrade would be on the shelf again. But luckily, the fight took place in March of 2017. Now, it did take place in Germany. It was for the regular, because they have it listed here as being for the WBA World Super Welterweight title. It was the regular title. That's one thing I want to point out. I forget who I think it was Andrade Lara was actually the super champion at the time, but this was for the regular title. Demetrius Andrade actually had to vacate WBO after that issue with Top Rank. So he was fighting here for the regular title, and he really did not look good in this fight. Bear in mind that I watched that fight, and I watched it on Sky, and Sky kept alluding to inactivity 9 months out of the ring. 9 months out of the ring is not anything major. Demetrius Andrade looked out of his comfort zone. He really did. He was boxing very strange. He wasn't settling. And Demetrius Andrade is someone who can switch hit quite well. Now, he's got good power in both stances. Primarily prefers to fight out of the southpaw stance. And he did that in this fight. But late on in the fight, it seemed as though Jack Culcay could just get the southpaw angles, get adjusted with the southpaw angles better. So when Demetrius Andrade actually switched to orthodox, he actually had a lot more success, believe it or not. It was the strangest thing. Normally you'd think it'd be the other way around. But he won this fight. It was a split decision. One judge scored it to Jack Culcay. I don't know why. Giuseppe something. Yeah, he scored it to Jack Culcay. I don't know what he was watching. It was a very competitive fight, but Demetrius Andrade was the winner. And actually, at that stage, he had signed a deal to go and work with HBO. So I believe there was a 3-fight deal with HBO. So his next 3 fights were going to be on HBO. And the first one was against the guy, Atlanta Fox, who was undefeated at the time. Now, Demetrius Andrade, he was dropped in that fight in the 7th round. It was a bit of a strange knockdown, but that was the only kind of real bit of success for the most part Atlanta Fox had in the fight. Demetrius Andrade looked very good in the fight, controlled it very well. His speed was on point. He looked quite good, and I put it down to the fact that this was a more active Demetrius Andrade. Yes, he was albeit dropped, but I was hopeful again, because we're seeing a more active Demetrius Andrade. He'd been calling for a Triple G fight in the past. He'd been calling for Andrade Lara, guys like that. It looked to me as though we were on the right track with him. But having said that, he went inactive again. He went inactive again and announced that he would be then signing with Eddie Hearn and Matchroom, and he was going to move up to 160 pounds. He actually moved to 160 pounds for the Atlanta Fox fight. So he was going to move up in weight, 160 pounds. It was going to be very interesting to see who he fights next. Well, in Boston in October of 2018, his first fight, Matchroom, on the zone, it was going to be against Billy Joe Saunders, which to me, I was very excited about. I remember at the time being excited, picking Demetrius Andrade to win that fight. Not expecting a compelling fight. I thought it would be a bit negative, but thinking Demetrius Andrade is better. He will win. The inactivity worried me a bit, but I thought he would win this fight. ran into a bit of issue. Billy Joe and which Andrade never fought. Why? Well, yeah. So, Billy Joe, I don't know. I forget the ins and outs of it. I think it was the Boston Commission didn't want Billy Joe to fight, or they wouldn't let him. UCAD said it was okay. He ended up vacating. He wasn't stripped. He ended up vacating his WBO title. So, Demetrius Andrade had to fight for a vacant. The next in line was a 17-0 guy called Walter Kawandakwa. Now, 17-0 on paper seemed alright, but who was there? How were you to really know how good this guy was? The answer, short answer, not very good. He was bounced up and down off the canvas in this fight. Demetrius Andrade won every minute of every round. It was not competitive at all. And one would have had to wonder what would have happened if it had been Billy Joe in there. It would have been a lot more interesting to see what would have happened if it had been Billy Joe. I still think to this day he would have won. It's impossible to know now at this stage, but we can only surmise. Kawandakwa was very, very weak. Very, very weak challenger for Demetrius Andrade. But I give him the benefit of the doubt there. He wasn't meant to fight Kawandakwa. He was meant to fight Billy Joe Saunders. You got to give him the benefit of the doubt there. You can't hold that against him. It's not his fault that his opponent had to vacate and, pull out and etc. So, is he going to fight Billy Joe next? Are we going to see? He's WBO 160-pound champion. He's going to get some good names, isn't he? Artur Akabov next. Oh boy, it's not getting good. So Artur Akabov, 19-2, famously lost to Billy Joe in a voluntary in 2016. Very competitive fight. Billy Joe looked extremely poor that night. A lot of people felt that Akabov won. Demetrius Andrade stopped him in the 12th in one of the dodgiest stoppages you'll ever see. Nothing happened. Nothing was really landing from Demetrius Andrade. Akabov wasn't hurt. Referee Artur Mercanti Jr. jumped in and stopped it. No idea why. Artur Mercanti Jr. has had some weird stoppages in his career. Famously, I forget who Pernell Whitaker fought, but what was his name? The guy he knocked out in 11 rounds where he was out cold on the ropes and he kept hitting him. Yeah, that was Artur Mercanti Jr. Not like his father, Artur Mercanti Sr., who was a great referee. Artur Mercanti Jr. has a lot of question marks around him. But that was a weird stoppage. It was a fight that Demetrius Andrade, has to be said, was winning comfortably anyway. But the stoppage was very bizarre. Very bizarre. Next fight was against Selecki. Selecki was a good, solid contender, it has to be said. His only loss came to Danny Jacobs in a fight that was very competitive. And, well, very interestingly, he didn't have as much problems as Danny Jacobs did. He won every minute of every round. Dropped Selecki. Looked very good doing it. So, I give him that. That was a decent win. I'll give him that because Selecki is awkward. He is tricky for guys at world level. He's kind of fringe world level Selecki. But you would have thought that at that point he's had 2 voluntaries. He's had 2 nice soft touches. It's a 3-fight deal at Matchroom. It's going to get better, isn't it? He's going to fight someone in his next fight that's going to be good. We're hearing, there's names out there. We've been mentioning Canelo. Will Canelo come down to 160 and fight him after fighting Kovalev? I don't know, but if he can get a good marquee name. Liam Williams' name was being announced as well because Liam Williams is now mandatory because at the end of 2019 he beat Atlanta's Fox and he beat him a lot more convincingly than Demetrius Andrade did. So who is he going to fight next? Luke Keeler. Luke Keeler is brave, gutsy, but look there on screen, he was completely outmatched. He was down from the very, very first punch of the fight. First punch of the fight. Luke Keeler's 2 losses had been at domestic level. He'd been ironed out at domestic level. Although Luke Keeler had improved under Pete Taylor, and Pete Taylor is an excellent coach, with the greatest respect, Luke Keeler shouldn't really have been anywhere near world level. He got that fight off the back of what a lot of fighters are doing nowadays, defending a tricky title and getting an artificially high ranking as a result. He was dispatched of in 9 rounds. Demetrius Andrade really didn't look good in this fight. Didn't look good at all, in my opinion, in this fight. Now, he was doing something that you don't normally see. He was really forcing everything. He was forcing the stoppage. He was forcing his work. He let this fight go on longer than he needed to because he was constantly looking for the shot to knock Luke Keeler out. The ending did come at the 9th round. Luke Keeler was stopped standing. Yeah, Yeah, that was a fair stoppage. I was just thinking, could you pull Luke Keeler out earlier? But no, he was game. He was gutsy. So then it's a year and a bit before Demetrius Andrade fights again. Towards the end of 2020, he was set to have a fight. I think there was 2 pullouts, and then eventually it was just like no go. It was meant to be a non-title fight at 168. But then he gets the mandatory shot, Liam Williams. Now this is a good fight. Liam Williams is a good fighter. Apart from Vanis Martirosyan and maybe Jack Culcay, you would say Liam Williams is the next best. Next best on Demetrius Andrade's resume. Now, this is very recent. I remember watching it. The review is still on my channel. It was a very good fight. Demetrius Andrade starts as he always tends to do. Starts very quick, very explosive, very fast. Faded a bit down the stretch in this fight. Now, the scorecards all read 118, 109, 118, 109, 116, 110. It was probably closer. The 116, 111 is probably the closest scorecard. It's probably the one that most reflects the fight. Liam Williams did have success. Demetrius Andrade looked good in parts, but looked very off in other parts. Moving incessively. Just looking very strange in there, be the best way to describe him. And not long after that, he went to the Canelo press conference after the Billy Joe fight, and he really didn't do himself any favours. He really didn't. He's clamouring for a big fight, but with a resume like this, you're not doing yourself any favours to get these big fights. I mean, Demetrius Andrade is 33 years old now. And now, last but not least, look, he might surprise me, but on November 19th, he's fighting Jay Quigley. Jay Quigley got battered from pillar to post against Torrio Johnson. I think that pretty much sums it up. I would rather see Torrio Johnson in there against Demetrius Andrade than Jay Quigley. There is better opponents in the top 15 than Jay goddamn Quigley. Jay Quigley is, no disrespect, but he is not anywhere near world level. I mean, the guy went life and death with Shane Mosley Jr. Shane Mosley Jr. is nothing like his dad. He's like his dad in name only, but he's nowhere. You should not be having tough fights with Shane Mosley Jr. under any stretch of the imagination. So that's the guy Demetrius Andrade is fighting next, Jay Quigley. Where are the big fights going to come from if you are just happy to take any easy fight? I rate Demetrius Andrade, as you can tell by some of the things I've said about him and his ability in this video. But I gotta call BS when I see it. It is BS, this resume. There's potential for better fights to be made. There's potential for bigger names. Demetrius Andrade has the potential to beat them names. The Billy Joe fight, yes, that's fair enough. That wasn't his fault. It didn't happen. That fight could still happen if Billy Joe is planning to come back to boxing. That's a name. You know, if Triple G beats Murata, there's a name. There's fights being made at 160 at Charlo. But it's like when them fights are being talked about, where's Demetrius Andrade? He's just wanting to talk about Canelo. Demetrius Andrade isn't a big draw. He has nothing for Canelo. He's a champion the weight below. Canelo's not going to come to 160. When Canelo fights Plant, and as we all expect him to, probably wins, what? Is he just going to give Demetrius Andrade a voluntary defence when Demetrius Andrade doesn't bring much to the table and Canelo could say, who have you beaten? Well, I beat Liam Williams, I beat Jay Quigley, I beat Luke Keeler. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Brilliant. Are you bringing a title? No. How is he going to get a fight? Demetrius Andrade is now 33. How much longer does he have in the game? Probably another 2-3 years, if even. The saddest part is when I look back at the Willie Nelson fight in 2016, you're probably looking at peak Andre back then. So I reckon he's been probably slowly declining. Not massively, but I don't think he's as good now. Probably not much removed, but still not as good now as he was back in 2016 to 2018. I think they were his peak years. I'm worrying, is he squandering his talent, not just by not getting these big fights made, but also by basically just fighting to the level of his opponent. He could be one of these fighters that he fights to the level of his opponent, but once you put him in there with an absolute elite, he can bring out all that I believe is there and several others believe is there. I wonder, will that happen with Demetrius Andrade? That's been my review of his career. What's the deal with Demetrius Andrade? Is it a confidence issue? Does he want to just have world titles and make money and, not take any risks? Or do you think that maybe some fighters see something in him, see his awkwardness, see his punching power, see his speed, and think he brings nothing to the table? He's a risk. If I beat him, you beat Demetrius Andrade. If I lose, what am I doing losing? Could that be it? I'll leave that for you to decide in the comment section. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, if you could, smash the like button. I enjoyed doing this top of Demetrius Andrade's career. I still hold out hope for him. I do. I still hold out hope for him. I'll watch his fight with Quigley. Hopefully it's on at a decent time. Can't see him having much trouble with Quigley, to be honest with you, but stranger things have happened. For now, lads and lassies, I'll leave it there. Smash the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell. Peace.